Welcome to the Touching into Presence podcast.
This podcast is for people who are interested in body work, empowerment, and somatic-based practices.
I am Nikki Olson.
I'm Andrew Rosenstock.
We are certified Rolfers.
Collectively, we're trained in various movement and bodywork therapies with an emphasis on somatic awareness and client resilience.
Through conversations, our goal is to share and explore mind-body paradigms to offer empowerment possibilities.
We're grateful to be in conversation with Brooke Thomas. Brooke works in a variety of ways to teach about how to cultivate a relationship with our bodies and therefore with our being, and how that can have a profound positive impact on an individual and collective level. At its core, her work is a lived inquiry about what it means to shift out of a mental conceptual lens and into an embodied experiential lens. This shift truly changes everything about how we meet ourselves and the world. She's a realization process teacher who works with clients one-on-one as an embodied coach and does group work within the online embodied practice community of Liberated Being. She was a Rolfer in her private practice for 20 years prior to this work. Brooke has run 2 podcasts, Liberated Body, which is now beginning again under the name Liberated Being, and Bliss Grit, which she co-created with her friend Vanessa Scotto. In today's conversation, we talk about the Liberated Being community, her podcasts, social media and reality online personas, embodied coaching, clients' anatomies pop quiz, and knowing when it's time. So with that, let's begin our talk.
Hey, Brooke.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Nice to meet you both.
Likewise.
Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah.
I'm just really excited to talk with you. I followed you periodically through your podcasts and blogs. I mean, I feel like you've been at this for quite some time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Putting out some fun content that I think was certainly back in the day when you were doing it quite sparse in terms of, especially this genre of embodiment, Rolfing.
Yeah.
So I've really appreciated the work that you started.
Thank you.
In a lot of ways, you were very inspirational as far as our podcast coming off, because when I started this, I sort of was listening to what was in the market, and a lot of what I was hearing, I didn't connect with so much. Whereas your previous podcast, not because you have a new one now, but the original one, Liberated
Body.
Body. Thanks. I almost said Liberated Being. Liberated Body. Clearly a fan.
It has become Liberated Being, so makes it understandable.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like Liberated Body was great. What I really enjoyed was, I think, you and what you brought. And a lot of the other podcasts I was hearing now, I think a lot are probably inspired from you, but the voice I couldn't connect with a lot. And there was, I think, too much Earth Mother, feminine goddess stuff. And then the opposite, like male, chauvinistic, and I wanted something else. So I was inspired a lot from what I heard from you to create something new. And then Nikki got involved, and we're not Liberated Body / Being 2.0. We're something different entirely, but there are similarities, and we have similar roots. We're all Rolf graduates, and we're all into embodiment. So at some point there will be overlap. We're definitely grateful. I think in a lot of ways, you could be seen as the grandmother of
I'll take it.
You'll take it. And you're like looking at the gray hairs, like grandmother.
Well, I've got mine too.
Yeah. So, along that, what prompted you to start the original podcast and the blogs and all that? Like what sort of put you on that field?
Well, so when I started Liberated Body, I had been in practice as a Rolfer. It's hard to remember the exact amount of time, but something like 13, 14 years or something. So I had been at it for a while, and I'm really a lifelong learner. And so it started as a blog and became a podcast where I really wanted to be able to bring some of the things I was learning and the dots I was connecting forward somewhere. Like, it really was a learning project that was mine. It wasn't intended initially as anything other. And when I began it, I really was thinking about it from the point of view of having, of being in practice as a Rolfer, and hearing and seeing similar things with my clients and thinking, I'll put something together where people have a much better sense of what their body is, what is this model of how we view the body, in this sort of unified way instead of bits and pieces of malfunctioning machinery, which is a lot of what the cultural frame is, right? And I had, probably well, I'll call it naive. I was going to say arrogant, but a really naive goal of, I will be able to, if I take this on as a learning project where I'm really devoted to talking to a number of different people and looking at a number of different disciplines, I'll be able to put together the packet, like the packet of information for people who I thought of as clients of mine about how they can be free of pain, age well, and just enjoy life in a body. So it started that way, and very quickly became something actually that it turned out was for the manual and movement therapy professionals. I guess I couldn't help my both nerdiness, like in terms of wanting to really deep dive into some of the subject matter, and then also this, for lack of a better word, a spiritual component that was the thread through everything, of not just talking about the body as an object, but body as being, as expression of, I only get to live inside of this the whole time I'm here as Brooke. And I have no idea what comes before or after, so I can talk about this. So with that, it became the people who were attracted to the show, attracted to the work, were other professionals. And that was really, really lovely and really gratifying to be able to connect with other people who were tracking similar learning journeys and explorations in themselves as well.
Pretty awesome. I resonate a lot with that, specifically because there was a lot of similarities. One of the original thoughts on my own place was like, oh, this can be a way when people are like, what is Rolfing? You can say, oh, listen to this podcast. And that was one of the original intentions sort of here, was that. And this has blossomed into more, and I'm sure yours will blossom to a lot more than you could have ever imagined. So much so that you started something entirely new after that. Well, was that sort of a progression from the original? And then I guess for those listening, maybe you can talk about what came after.
Sure. I was actually just talking yesterday with my friend Bo Forbes, which some you might know and some people listening might know. And I had her on my show a couple times. But she's a good friend. And like the people who know me well and who have followed this project, she was taking some time, as many have, to continue to remind me these projects are the same project. There's nothing separate about them. So she's always been a helpful, hold up the mirror to me. And I always knew that, but they can seem really separate. And it's partially because I've just been, going through a genuine lived process, as opposed to being a person who's trying to put together a system of knowing. I've been a person who's been exploring something. And so Liberated Body, I was talking with all these different kinds of people, anatomists, surgeons, biomechanists, yoga teachers, people who are coming up with new models of what, air quotes, fitness could mean. And the heart of it was really just asking this question over and over again, or the exploration that wasn't intended by me wound up becoming, what's a body? What's a body? What's a body? And I started from the point of view of body as object, right? I'm going to help my clients be able to spiff it up as much as possible. And the more I had these conversations and the more I lived my own process, I couldn't answer that question, and I still can't, except to say, there's something fascinating happening here. We get fascinated by cosmos, right? The cosmos and exploring the universe. And I find the body to be the same. It's about beingness It's about selfhood. It's also not. Like, there was nothing at all that had to do with me that started to make my cells divide as an embryo. Like, that's totally mystifying to me, and everything that's going on with my physiology right now while I'm talking to both of you has nothing to do with what I tend to consider me, right? Like, where I think about things and I make things happen, I make plans and I accomplish things and I understand things. I don't understand it. I don't make it happen. I don't accomplish it. And so it put me into this experiential place that could be described as spiritual. And my spiritual practice became somatic or body-based meditation, things related to interoception, things related to embodiment, and discovering how consciousness paired with the body. So to make that less esoteric, just things like how much of my time I spend way ahead of myself. Like, my mind is thinking and planning and thinking about the day, and my awareness is situated in front of my body. And when I come and inhabit my body, the way I experience myself, the world, my plans for the day, it completely changes. And I trained in something called realization process, which was created by a woman named Judith Blackstone. And that's still something that's a big part of what I teach and practice. I work with coaching clients and have that community, Liberated Being. And that's oriented in large part around the realization process. And wound up with Liberated Body. I have a very close friend, Vanessa Scotto. We've been friends for about 15 years. And we would have these conversations, sort of the after conversation of Liberated Body together, where I would be sort of putting together, well, what does that mean to me? How does that change me, my experience of myself? And she's a psychotherapist. So we put together a show that actually lasted for 4 years and just ended, where it was much more just two friends having those conversations in like of what we're sitting with, what we're shifting or metabolizing. And it was really lovely to live that process as well in public. And then there comes a time with every project where that's as long as it was going to go. And created Liberated Being, which is, I tied it to the name Liberated Body on purpose to say embodied practice and shifting how we experience ourselves based on our relationship with body and self has drastic shifts for us as people and for how we experience the world and participate in the world. So it's a community that's really built around embodied practice and the implications of what that means for how we live, really.
Was the podcast or the show that you did with your friend, Bliss and Grit?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember seeing, a newsletter or something that was put out, and I followed that a little bit. And I was like, gosh, that was like such a good idea. Because there's so many times, I have a certain, crew of girlfriends where we go into this chit chat of what is embodiment for you, or what embodiment practices are you doing now? What are we into? And it would always lend into these really great conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's really sweet that you and your friend had that.
I like that you say your girlfriends, because I was like, yeah, I have the same thing, and mine are with my female friends, because it is a generally less male oriented field, or it can be, which my girlfriend loves that I'm surrounded by females most of the time. But when you were saying that, I had this sort of same, like a lot of times after our talks, I have a friend who's a female we've done trainings together for years. She's a biodynamic cranial sacral Feldenkrais practitioner. And a lot of times we'll talk with someone on our show, and afterwards I'll call her up and be like, download, process, back and forth. Yep. Great. So I think it's a lovely idea. And I listened to a few of the episodes before I got inundated with just too many podcasts.
Right. There's a lot of them out there now.
Yeah. But no, I love the idea that as you as a body worker and a therapist, because that combination, you have soma and you have psych, and you start to bring that together is in my perspective, a lovely combination.
Yeah,
So.
we were always on the same page, weirdly. And we were also entering that conversation from totally different vantage points, which I think is what made it useful conversation for someone to listen to and not just a phone call that we should have kept to ourselves.
Yeah. I am sort of curious if it's comfortable to say, like, because it's your second podcast that more or less has ended for now. Mm-hmm. What is it that lets you know that, like, this is the time?
Yeah, because they're always started as inquiries and not as like a fixed sort of business plan or idea, which I'm not averse to, but that's never been the intent. I know that they're over when I feel like I have to do it. And when it's not, I can't, oh my gosh, I have a list of a dozen people, or I have, in the case of Bliss and Grit, 3 things that we could easily talk about today. And it just feels alive and like what you want to do. Like with Liberated Body, when I entered that work, I was still in a very, very mental place. I'm bright. I like learning. I like reading research and combing through it. And as I became more and more embodied, that became really hard work and also not that interesting to me. It is interesting, but it wasn't that interesting to me. Like I wasn't so interested in discovering what parts of the brain light up when I have an experience so much as I was just learning how to be with my experience. So that's how I knew that was time to shift. And then with Vanessa and I, with Bliss and Grit, we just put out a whole episode about, why we're moving on. So I won't belabor the point or anything because people can listen to that. But similarly, when we started that, it felt so fun to share our own inside out and outside in explorations. And then at a certain point, it felt like we wanted to have our own private experiences. And there is a risk if you stay in that too long that you start performing yourself. And we could see that risk coming in, and we didn't want to be locked into performing ourselves.
So well said, and so true. I mean, I think when we follow into the social media trap, which is, it can be so fun, and so there's so much out there, and it's like a goodie bag for any interest you really have. But you can, especially I think, for me, I've felt like I've witnessed that a little bit of people that I started following early on in maybe their journey where they didn't have a ton of followers or advertising things. And then the quality of their content kind of shifted a little out of the embodiment realm and kind of became into, a job. And, they're probably doing fine and it's serving their needs, but you definitely can see that quality shift in terms of something authentic. If I just want to share and be out there, then when it becomes kind of like forced, like I got to do this. It's my job. I got to create content. I got to be out there and like constantly representing. So I'm on the, however, Instagram and Facebook manages, who
right.
gets seen and all that, the shuffle game. But I think that's so well said and so honest and appreciated.
Yeah, and I think the word you said in really particular, Nikki, is that it's the authenticity, because I think there's that balance between performance and being yourself. And when it starts to become more performance, it can lose the authenticity. And I mean, a lot of what makes your podcast and you so great is the fact that you're being honest. You mean, this is what it is. And if you're doing a talk back and forth with each other and it's like, it loses that authenticity, it loses the whole entire feel of the show.
Yeah. For years, it was like we couldn't wait to be recording and to see what we would talk about. And now we just do that as friends on the phone, just like we did before the show. And it sounds like a show. We always joke like, wish I had pushed record, because it truly is what we care about talking about. But it is an interesting time where there's a lot of reward if you turn yourself into a reality TV show. And we didn't want to, because embodiment is about genuineness, and it's about a level of honesty that's not super common. I don't mean that like I have this thing that other people don't have. I mean, it's a practice that I'm devoted to and will always be living. So you have to watch when you start to, put on the reality TV show, and the temptations to like follow that model, like you were saying, Nikki, on Instagram and Facebook and things like that. And I have no problem with people, just to be clear, making money, having voices, having things to say, but we have to watch, we get conditioned by what is the dominant stuff happening so quickly. And there's a lot of this turning yourself into a reality TV show, which I didn't want to do.
And it's hard to, I would imagine it's hard to talk about embodiment and when you're doing a reality TV show, because in some ways, at least in my construct, while they can be similar, reality TV shows, we all know, is no longer reality. It's staged. It's like, so you can be authentic and create wonderful social media, and you can script everything out and have that, but still be you. But when it starts to become that next thing where it dominates your life, and you're thinking all the time, well, how do I be in this video, but how do I show off this thing, right? And there starts to be that separation. Yeah, I'm sure there are many social media people who are very authentic and very,
for sure.
But a lot of ones who I've worked with as some influencers, they're some of the most unhappy people I've ever met.
It becomes a prison.
Yeah, it becomes very much so. So it's always be careful for what you wish for.
Well, it's a good conversation, just to cap that off, is good conversation for people out there, especially, I mean, I trained or was part of the teaching world of the now Dr. Ida Rolf Institute. And it was always interesting when there was the conversation of practice building. And practice building, you and I are probably, I was certified almost 20 years ago. So practice building then to now, grossly different. And it is, putting an Instagram page is a lot more fun than creating pamphlets and standing out and handing them out to people or getting your new fancy business card. Mm-hmm. But it's worth noting that, because it could be happening unconsciously for some people, if they're getting excited about what they're, the creativity that goes into their content, somebody liking it and watching the followers and getting kind of wrapped up into that. And it just kind of an important opportunity for you to take for yourself is to take a step back and be like, okay, I need to have a reality check of where is my heart in this work, and am I making sure that it's still staying relevant to the content that I'm putting out. Yeah.
And making sure that our lives get to belong to us. Because obviously, I don't have a problem with using these tools, having done a podcast, and I run an online community and, things like that. But they can start to own all of our thoughts and behaviors in a weird way, where it's like, oh, I just had an interesting little light bulb thought. I should turn that into a post for today. And if we're always, thinking that way, and this is just for me, I have friends and colleagues who I think have navigated this really well. But yeah, it was something that for me has just not been something I can make myself do.
Well, I imagine it's hard to also be a meditation teacher and teaching about being present while being like, ooh, I have to get a photo of this because I have to do this and I have to do this, which is like the opposite of being present.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about what you're doing now but before that, we have one question which we're just really dying to know, which is, are you still Rolfing? Do you still do manual work?
You're asking me this on a weird week. So I just announced to my clients this week that I am closing my practice. So that I guess I could say it was kind of in the works, but obviously was more of a surprise with COVID. Was not what I anticipated doing. So with my son, we're part of a homeschool co-op, which we commuted an hour away to. And so because my work involved touching people and where my home is and not an hour away where the co-op was, I knew that things were going to have to shift and I was going to have to emphasize my online work, which I have been shifting into for years anyway, and doing more and more, of client work on Zoom with the embodied, I call it embodied coaching. It's primarily realization process, but also pulls a lot from John Prendergast's heart inquiry work. So I don't just call it one thing because it's kind of a mashup. And then, COVID came along in March and touch-based work wasn't happening. And once I'm in Connecticut, which is a state that was in a really bad way when we first went into lockdown and has been doing really well since about June. So I set up a backyard table and saw a few clients, some people who I've worked with for a decade or so in my backyard, which was in some ways really lovely to reconnect that way and do touch work after being at home for so long. But I just knew I wasn't going to be reopening my office in this because of, some health things that I have personally. It was a higher risk choice than it might be for some. And my heart is in teaching this embodied practice. Like I really light up doing that. So life just kept pushing me out of the nest. This nest is pushing you out. And so I just announced that this week. But it was actually October 6th would have been, I can't remember if it's 20 years or 21 years. So it was a while.
Oh, your practice is almost old enough to drink.
Yeah, I know. Maybe it's its big 21st birthday this year and I robbed it of the festivities.
Well, one of the nice sort of, again, coming back to earlier is like what you were saying, things have their course and it's all a part of something else. But, similarly, you stopped Liberated Body. And then I think in May, you put something out, or recently you put like a one talk out.
I did a class.
Yeah. I think so. Even like the Rolfer can close for now, and then later it can open if that is, and if not, everything has their time and place.
Yeah.
So that's a great way. We didn't plan this, but the transitions are wonderful. It's a great way to transition to sort of your embodied coaching. What are you doing now? What is that sort of thing? What lights you up about it?
Yeah. So with embodiment, if it's not going to become a concept, which like we all have such strong conditioning around that we're living from such a mental conceptual place. So you'll see that, for example, when people, do studies about meditation, it's like it lowers your heart rate and it makes you more productive, right? And that's objectifying meditation. Like, oh, good, I'm going to take the pill and get the benefits. It has this very pharmaceutical kind of feeling. But when people are living embodied practice, like what I described, right, I notice, where am I located? Am I always way out ahead of myself? How do I locate inside myself, which I don't do 100% of the time? And I'm not holding myself to that either. It's a playful, lived practice. What is my experience when I can locate my awareness in my heart when I am checking out at the grocery store? How does that change? And not in this way where I'm pulling on someone to see me as the most heart-centered, most amazing person ever, but like I'm literally just inhabiting that place and just noticing what shifts and changes. So it's very intimate and it comes up against all of our stuff, all the ways that we've been conditioned to objectify ourselves, our experiences, and all of the habits we have of what we've been trained to do from family of origin, which is like the good people are like fill in the blank is kind of what we absorb at a young age. And then culture of origin, much larger container, the good people are like blank, busy and perfectionistic and, all of these different things. So in the coaching work, the intimacy of being able to really be embodied together and to see where these things are playing out, like what are the threads that we can follow that lead us into a new experience, shifting to a different way of orienting and knowing and being. Yeah, I think it's been important for me personally in my own process. And I love doing that with my clients. And then Liberated Being is group work, which is also very satisfying and just different, so we practice together live, and we run on something that's basically like a private social media network, so if we come up against something, we can communicate about it there together, and also see that we're not alone and that other people are in this weird thing that's hard to even articulate. And having their own experience of it and their own path of it.
That sounds very, it's clear that you are oriented from a sense of embodiment, just in terms of, the way you've spoken about liberated body, transitioning into liberated being and bliss and grit, really being mindful of what you want to share and when it's time to stop sharing and do something different. And I think that I haven't followed so much of the more recent content that you put out, but when you were talking about how, your interest with liberated body and coming from, kind of a body nerdy, really getting into the science of it, as you were saying that and I get to see you, I was like, wow, that really did resonate. As a viewer of that, I really appreciated that you had this nice balance of really kind of going for the raw data, the real, like the science information, but then incorporating where a Rolfer or a body manual therapist would want to know that kind of information. Mm-hmm. So it's fun to to see and hear you speak about that, because in a way you've always been on like a radar for me of like when I'm kind of out there looking for fun new information, so your name will pop up and I'm like, oh yeah. And like I mentioned, like I remember, I'm not really sure what you and Rachel are doing, but I was like, oh yeah, that was Rachel's friend. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's just, I think you're going to be super fun to continue to follow as you are very mindful of the content. And I think our listeners who want to follow you will have a better understanding who you are, and that you're really coming from a place of creating true, authentic meaning with what you're doing, and not just putting something out there because it's, the fad in the movement world. But yeah, you have some really great guests that you have on your podcast. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I was fortunate that so many of those people had conversations about their work at that time.
And what's really nice is, I came to it later. I think, you've probably been doing it for a few years by the time I found it, but it was still relevant. Mm-hmm. It still is there. And I think for a lot of people, it's and it's part of what Nikki and I were sort of hoping about this is one thought was, okay, you're going to Rolfing or the Guild School and you want to know more about the field. Here's resources you don't have before. Here you can hear a Rolfer from the 1970s, a Rolfer from this, a craniosacral, or whatever the greater scheme is. And it just sort of lives out there for better or for worse. So it's in a lot of ways, it's a real nice, I would say your podcast in particular is a nice gift for humanity.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been amazed, actually. I was actually just on my publishing platform today because I'm about to start publishing as Liberated Being podcast. So we have these guest teacher gatherings in the community, and I'm pulling little bits of embodied wisdom out. So you'll see that coming up on what used to be Liberated Body feed. I'm just changing the name, but I was looking and seeing, and it always amazes me that thousands of people are still listening every month, because I haven't been making that podcast for years. And I got to talk to a lot of my heroes, people who, when I was training, I was reading their books and reading their papers, and it was really lovely to be able to talk to them, because we're a weird bunch, right? Like, people who are practicing this form of body work and embodiment, like, we are outside of the model of body as like machinery that is either doing a good job or a bad job, and is breaking down or doing well. So getting to talk to people in all these sort of in between places of posture as an exploration, as opposed to like, well, what's the right way to do posture, would be sort of the more common frame. So yeah, it was a great joy. And I'm always amazed that people are still listening to those episodes from, like you were quoting, 2015 or something like that, a while ago.
So a question I have, which is, how did or does Rolfing or your Rolf practice influence your embodied coaching, the platform you have now? How did it, or what of that? Or maybe another question would be, how did you go in from that into this?
Well, I mean, I'm sure it's influenced me in many ways that I can't even articulate. And the one that I can see is, being a Rolfer really taught me how to be in relationship with people in a therapeutic setting. That it wasn't about following these sort of rules of ways to be, although of course I followed ethical rules, but that there's something about when you drop into that space with your client and you're, doing touch-based work, and you're not vigilantly tracking what's going on with their body, but you're listening, you're listening with your whole being, and you're really present to them. I can't have asked for a better training in how to really be with people. Like, that level of presence isn't something that's common in other professions. If I'd gone from web designing to coaching, I probably would have a much different way of dropping into presence with people. So it taught me that in a beautiful way. And then, if I can be completely honest about one of the things that broke my heart over and over again, and that was a part of wanting to actually leave Rolfing, which people who are listening will say, well, you could have just changed that. It's like, I did work with that. And what I found is that people are really convinced that there's something wrong with them. And we're all reared on that, like mother's milk in this culture. What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? But people would always, because my practice started such a long time ago, and my orientation, so I found Rolfing because I grew up with significant chronic pain and mobility issues and neurological issues from a birth injury. So Rolfing, air quotes, fixed me. And so I had a practice where I, air quotes, fixed people. I had people who, well, my ankle hurts, fix it, my back hurts, fix it. And all of us get some of that to a certain degree or another. And people do notice that their lives are changing, that their way of relating is changing, that their emotions are changing through the work. But a lot of people were still entering through Fix Me. And people wanted a lot of, please deliver to me what's wrong with me. And I couldn't do it anymore. I mean, I couldn't do it for a long, long time, right? But I understand the question, so if somebody comes in with ankle pain and you're checking the range and mobility of that ankle joint, it makes perfect sense that they would ask, what's wrong with the range? Is there a way that it has problem moving? What's the problem? So I understand that 100%, but it was like such a hard frame, because if I would say, oh yeah, dorsiflex is just great, but the plantar flexion is something's off here, which was true, the way that it would be interpreted and held onto as, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? And that it was always like this, well, what are you touching now? Well, why is that so tight? Well, am I walking wrong? Am I standing wrong? Well, tell me what I'm doing wrong. Tell me what's wrong with me. And honestly, it was illuminating, and it's a part of what made me want to go into the embodied coaching world, is because I'm interested in that. that we can shed this "there's something wrong with me" lens that is so challenging. And I often, with my clients, would bring that up, right? So I didn't just dodge it for a bunch of years and then bail on my practice. We would talk about it, but it was very challenging for people to let go of that. And even just things like, I would call it like anatomy pop quiz. What are you touching now? What are you touching now? And I remember when I interviewed on Liberated Body, Pete Walker, not Pete Walker. He wrote a different book on trauma. I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. I literally just met with him as a guest teacher on Liberated Being. It'll come to me. He wrote the book Intelligent Yoga. And he was telling me, this was actually, I moderated him on a panel in New York, and he was telling me that he would sometimes make up, when people would ask him that question, well, when I do this, what's working? What muscle am I using? He would make up muscle names. Well, that's your anterior crucifornius, People go, oh, okay. And then towards the end of the class, he'd be like, that's actually, I'm a little bit of a trickster. I made that up. Peter Blackaby. And he would do it. He's a very loving person. He doesn't care to mess with people. And he would say, did it change your experience of it? Or was it just a word that you could grab onto and feel like you could pin something down? Because probably it actually kept you a little bit from whatever your experience was, because you felt like, oh, right, that's the anterior crucifornius, and it laterally rotates my blah, 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 as opposed to just feel what it's like to be moving your leg right now. And I really admired that when he said that. I also found it wildly hilarious. But there is such a strong, I am an object that's either getting it right or getting it wrong. And please tell me which box I get to put myself in. That was a part of me moving on.
It's interesting hearing that, and I might get the muscle wrong, anterior crucius fornicus.
Yes.
I know. but
when you've said enough of these words, you can just pull different mix and match every year.
I have that a lot of how when I come to practice, it's all about the embodiment of it and the awareness. When people ask me sometimes, I have sort of a sharp New England nature where my answer in the past might be like, well, does that matter? Does that, which isn't really building. I sort of stopped doing that because it doesn't. If someone's asking and I say, well, does that matter? That then doesn't help the relationship a lot. So the way that he did it, I feel like is a nicer way. I feel like for my own practice, I have to fine tune that still, find a way that gives them the experience, but doesn't cut them down, but also gets the same thing. Like what I'm touching in this moment in a lot of ways are the exact muscle or ligament or joint or nerve. Doesn't necessarily have to do with the whole entire process of whatever you're experiencing.
Yeah. And I live and have practiced for, the whole second half of my practice for like the last 11 years near the Yale campus. So a lot of my clients are Yale students, Yale professors, Yale deans. So very, very, filled with a lot of very bright, intellectual, academic Ivy League minds. And so one of the things that I would say to people that actually worked is if it was a lot of anatomy pop quiz or what's wrong with me, I'd say, your life is filled with you being really, really bright about so many things. And this is just this little gem of a moment where you get to just have a pure experience of your body. And sometimes I wouldn't lay it on this thick, depending on their personality, right? But sometimes I would be a little more short and sweet about it. But if they were open to it and just say, like, just let yourself feel what this feels like without labeling what may be wrong or not wrong and what Latin name gets attached to it. And for some people that helped because it felt like being invited into this delicious experience that they actually don't get to have very often because their mind is constantly churning on really complex intellectual problems.
And I feel like you're tapping into this new, it shouldn't really be new, but a way of talking about our bodies and experiencing our bodies in a way that isn't so much about tagging, because I think sometimes people are, the pop quiz, I like how you just said that, like the pop quiz anatomy questions. that's everybody has their starting place, and that might be their way of like feeling into being embodied, because, you know, some people have no idea that the leg is like the lower leg and the lower arm are two bones.
Yeah.
And to start having that experience. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting comparison that you did with your Yale clientele,
Mm-hmm.
because that's probably the way they've oriented and have learned. And most of us, I mean, it is, we're so into wanting to label, to have an understanding, but to be vague and curious. That's risky in some ways, because that means that you're not nailing on this really fancy word that everybody can throw out, like, you know, in the fitness world, psoas. The psoas is this mystery, super cool muscle, where it's like, it is, but there's also a lot of other super cool muscles and things that happen in your body that make profound movements. I mean, I had a client who, you know, she had a significant car accident, quite a bit of trauma throughout her body, and just simply taking her arm into an external rotation and a side bend of her head, just stretch a lateral compartment of her head, neck, sent her right into a memory where she's like, I'm in tears. And simple movement. Mm-hmm. But staying in, I mean, it could have been, the stretch could have happened in any other moment. But the languaging that we were doing in terms of this movement practice, what I think was setting her up to feel safe to step into an experience.
And the presence you brought, you know, invites somebody into an experience, which is just really different than, you know, what category can I put my body in, or what category can I put parts in? Like you were saying about the psoas, right? We decide some parts are super fascinating, so magical, and other parts are like adipose tissue, not magical. It's like, why? You know, it's kind of all pretty magical.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And from a practitioner point of view too, I have to check myself, because in my movement work, I hold a pretty wide spectrum of it. Can be very experiential to, you know, a cardio HIIT experience. Mm-hmm. But
which I personally love. So yeah, I'm a fan of all of the kinds of movement.
Yeah. But I have to I'm still always, when I'm on that experiential spectrum, I'm always feeling like, well, not always, but I catch myself. Even I've gotten reinforcement from the client. I'm like, are you sure you don't want to have cardio? Are you sure you're not looking for your heart rate to get pumping? They're like, no, you're doing something. I like what I'm doing with you. You're totally different. And it's like, yeah, I can add on some kind of familiar Pilates, yoga. I have a bunch of different modality backgrounds. But it's just, this conversation is just kind of mirroring to me too, of like, as much as I also really love the embodiment and love to work with that language and experience with people, I think because what we're so used to seeing in the mass publications of content and social media and everything like that. I mean, listen, if you're scrolling through Instagram, is it going to be more exciting to see somebody do a ballistic jump? And they might be thinking of like, oh, yielding to the ground and feeling to the sky. That's going to be a little bit more fun to watch than someone sitting and slowly moving. Sure. So it's just kind of interesting.
Yeah.
The embodiment eye candy that is so much more out there than what really is happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, and noticing too, you know, I'm repeating myself a bit, but how much of our frame is about problematizing things. Like I remember when I was teaching group yoga classes, and I had this sort of out of body moment I'd been teaching for a few years, where I heard myself doing this very compelling fear mongering thing where I'm like, well, you have to do this with your shoulders, or you might wind up with a frozen shoulder like X percentage Americans over the age of 45 do, right? I probably wasn't being quite so egregious about it. But the way I was observing myself was like, why do we always have to jump ahead and tell people the reason why you're moving? Not all of us, right? But I had gotten into this rut where I had this modeled, and it became compelling to do subtle fear mongering to make people interested in their bodies or to do a certain movement. Well, if you don't do this, if you don't do lateral hip stabilizing movements, you'll be like one of those many who XYZ, winds up with hip bursitis or whatever. Because I had been taught in that way. And I just don't want to do fear mongering anymore. I certainly don't want to do it around people's bodies. And I don't want to turn us into problems anymore, even though sometimes we have problems that need to be addressed. But that's different than jumping out ahead of something, being like, careful, careful. If you don't, and we see that a lot in the Instagram world too.
Yeah. Well, the important thing is we're all going to have problems.
Yeah. We're human beings.
We got it. Yeah.
Weird stuff. Not perfect.
Yeah. But we don't want to be identified with it. I mean, some people want to because it orients them or fulfills something for them. But yeah, hopefully we can eventually break away from this idea that we should be pain-free. I mean, be nice to not have so much pain, but being completely pain-free your whole entire life, I mean, not realistic. It's like when you're in pain, how do you get to be in pain and not let it ruin your world? And that you can be resourced with it.
Yeah. And that's another disembodied lens, right? Is perfection. That we one day will cross the finish line or grab the brass ring and be perfect. We'll move perfectly. We'll breathe perfectly. We'll sleep perfectly. We'll have zero pain. And that's just actually not what the human experience is, as far as I can tell.
Do either of you remember the movie Parenthood?
I don't think I saw that one.
It's an amazing cast. It's a comedy. Steve Martin, Rick Moranis, Keanu Reeves, Jason Robards. A lot of...
That's good stuff, yeah.
It's great stuff. It's from the 80s, maybe early 90s. Still holds up. But there's this scene where the grandfather was talking to, I think his son, I forget. And he basically says, like, you never cross the finish line. You never spike the football. As a kid, I watched it, didn't quite understand it, but it got planted in. And it's somewhat true. I think that we're constantly crossing the finish line. At the same point, there's always more to do. At the same point, each step is crossing a finish line. Each step is spiking a touchdown.
Yeah, that's a lovely frame to bring in, so instead of like, you never get to cross the finish line, right? It's like every moment is crossing the finish line.
I'll write to the directors. I just came up with that addendum there. But I mean, that's how, when I hear you saying, so I'm a lot more fresh not at body work, but at Rolfing. And Rolfing really changed how I approach body work. And I hear you. I leave sessions with people who are like, what's wrong with me? What's this? More tired than with others. But I currently, because I'm a fresh young newbie who's like, I can take on the model of we're educators. And so it can be a job of us to help shift that framework from that and into this. Like, give me like 5 more years and I may call you up and be like, dude, I'm fucking exhausted now. I hear you.
And it depends where you're located too. I'm in the Northeast in a Ivy League town. So that I remember going to a continuing ed training with Continuum, and there was a lesson with the teacher was from Berkeley. There was a lesson on teaching people how to make subtle incremental movements to unwind their own spine. Beautiful. Such beautiful work. Not super applicable for my Northeastern Ivy Leaguers, where I'm just going to talk to you while you sit on a table and unwind your own spine is just, it works really well in certain places, depending on who your clientele are. And it is our work to be a bridge, right, into a different relationship that people have with their bodies. And that was one of the honors of my practice. And so a part of it was just, how do you know when a project is done? Training and realization process felt like I'm now in a realm where in Rolfing, people could treat me a little bit like an alternative to physical therapy, right? In some ways I am. With realization process, it's so explicit, right? It's like you're coming here to develop a relationship with yourself and to step outside of these disembodied frames of perfectionism. What's wrong with me? All these things that we all absorbed that don't help us to lead particularly full or nourishing lives. So you'll be great. And you're gonna be able to help people to have a different relationship with their bodies, which is quite a lovely thing to be able to do for work.
Yeah. And your work is also just very lovely. And the way that a fair amount of body workers, I think, are all going in that, like, less fix me, more create that relationship with yourself.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like we all get on this ride. Some people know they're getting on that ride, but in my experience, a lot of us don't. I didn't. And we all seem to evolve in that direction. I talk with a lot of my friends and colleagues too. And something's shifting. Hopefully it's something that's shifting representative, right, in the larger collective that we're experiencing in our practices. Yeah. I would just say, and this might not apply for the people who listen to this show, but I find that even with my friends and colleagues who are in work of embodiment, there can still be these confusions or blind spots, that embodiment is something we do, right? So we're trying to talk about something that's a very slippery fish, and that the invitation is to play with that in whatever way or work is already in people's lives. There's so many different ways to play with that.
That's lovely. So if people want to play with you, how do they do that?
Well, so Liberated Being .community is the website for the embodied practice community. And actually, I'm not sure when this episode was out, but that is going to close September 15th because I'm switching to doing an immersion. So we're going to start an immersion in January. And that's in part because, we've been doing live practice together 6 days a week. We have guest teachers once or twice a month. And that's been lovely. But I wanted the frame to be a little more clear, like what are this sort of terrible languaging, but what are the core competencies of embodiment? And then how do we bridge that into our lives instead of it just being something we do here and there, or try out a smattering of practices here and there, or a smattering of guest teachers. So that will be available to people. And that's going to be a 10-month process where I bring in 10 guest teachers. And I'm also, teaching, and we're bridging in a sequence that I think makes sense. But not just me, other colleagues of mine as well, bridging embodied practice into actually really shifting our lens out of, it's not a small thing, right? Like out of what we have been conditioned as a lens that we're seeing life through. So I'm really looking forward to that. And that starts in January. So there's that. And then my coaching practice, people can find at brookethomas.me. And there's some opportunities to work with me that way as well.
Thank you for taking time to share with us. It's been really interesting to learn about your process and your journey with the work.
Thank you.
Yeah, and like you referenced earlier, one of the nice parts of this podcast is to get to meet people who have in some way or another touched your life. And you have done that for me in a lot of ways. So it's really been an honor, and it's nice. It's nice when you get to see the person and interact with the person instead of just listening or reading. So it's been really lovely. Thank you for that.
Thank you. And thanks to both of you for putting together this project. I think the more of these, the better, where we can be sitting in these kinds of inquiries and talking with other like-minded structural integrators and Rolfers and different manual movement therapists. It's good work. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. You too.
Take care.
Bye. Ciao. Thank you for listening to us at Touching into Presence. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. You can find out more about Brooke at brookethomas.me and liberatedbeing.community. Please feel free to leave us positive reviews on your favorite podcast players, and please share us with people who may be of interest. We do this for all of you out there and do hope we're making a difference in your worlds. We look forward to hearing back from you and seeing you on our next conversation at Touching Into Presence. Bye-bye.